The train from Florence rattled to a slow crawl as the first lights of Rome came into view. Lorenzo pressed his face against the window, half to catch the glimmer of the Tiber beneath the stars, half to steady himself against the heavy anticipation that had been gnawing at him since the journey began. The eternal city, grand and untouchable, lay before him like a secret he had been invited to witness, but not to truly belong to. He was not a pilgrim, nor a priest, nor even a believer in the strictest sense. He was a writer, and the invitation that drew him here carried a weight more intoxicating than faith, an offer whispered in coded letters and sealed with symbols that only deepened his curiosity. The station was crowded with merchants, travelers, and weary soldiers returning from faraway postings. But as Lorenzo stepped down with his single leather satchel, he felt eyes upon him. Rome had a way of noticing strangers, of absorbing them and testing whether they were worthy of her darker heart. He adjusted his coat, lit a cigarette, and began the walk toward the Vatican district, his shoes striking cobblestones that had borne centuries of secrets. The air grew heavier the closer he came to the looming walls of the Holy See. Pilgrims shuffled through archways, murmuring prayers while Swiss guards stood rigid, their halberds gleaming even under the pale lamps. The grandeur was undeniable, yet beneath it all pulsed an unease that Lorenzo could not ignore. He recalled the words of the letter, written in an elegant but trembling hand. "If you wish to know what Rome hides, come at night. Within these walls lies not only holiness, but hunger." He found lodging in a modest inn not far from the piazza. San Pietro, a place frequented by both scholars and the occasional fugitive from noble families who preferred to remain unseen. The innkeeper, a woman with eyes too sharp to be fooled, asked no questions beyond his name. In the silence of his room, Lorenzo unfolded the letter once again, tracing its lines by candlelight. The ink had faded, but the urgency in its words had not. That first night he walked aimlessly around the square, drawn to the colonnades that embraced the pilgrims like open arms. Above him, statues of saints gazed down with stony silence, their shadows stretching like watchful sentinels. He imagined them whispering judgments, warning him to turn back, but he pressed forward. Midnight bells echoed through the city, deep and resonant, and he noticed a hooded figure moving deliberately along the colonnade's curve. The figure stopped briefly, turned its head toward him, and then disappeared into a small door set into the wall. Curiosity surged through his veins, stronger than any wine. He followed, but when he reached the door, it was shut. No guards, no locks he could see, only the faint scent of incense escaping through the cracks. He touched the handle, but something in him hesitated. Instead, he marked the door in his mind and returned to his room, though sleep refused to come. The following day, Rome shone in all its brilliance, sunlight striking domes and fountains, merchants hawking relics, pilgrims on their knees in the square. But Lorenzo moved through it all as though in a dream. He bought bread from a street vendor, drank bitter coffee, and let the city pass around him, all the while waiting for night. He had not come for the surface beauty of Rome. He had come for what hid beneath it. When the second night fell, he lingered in a tavern near the Borgo district. The tavern smelled of sweat, garlic, and unwashed wool, a place where secrets spilled as freely as wine. A group of young seminarians huddled at a corner table, their laughter too loud, their robes too loose around flushed faces. Lorenzo listened without meaning to. They spoke of ceremonies, of forbidden books kept locked in the apostolic library, and of women whose names were never to be written. Their words carried the reckless confidence of youth, but behind them lay something darker. One of them noticed Lorenzo's gaze and fell silent, the others following suit like sparrows sensing a hawk. Later, when he stepped outside, he found the same hooded figure waiting near the fountain. No words were exchanged. The figure simply gestured for him to follow. This time, Lorenzo did not hesitate. They wove through narrow alleys until they reached the small door again. The figure produced a key, opened the passage, and slipped inside. Lorenzo followed, the air immediately changing. Cooler, damper, heavy with incense, and something faintly metallic. The door closed behind him, sealing out the night. They moved down a stone corridor lit only by flickering lamps. The hooded figure finally spoke, the voice soft but urgent, neither distinctly male nor female. You seek the truth of Vatican nights, but truth here is not a gentle thing. It is not written in books, not spoken in sermons. It is lived in silence and in hunger. Do you still wish to see? Lorenzo swallowed hard. His heart pounded with both dread and anticipation, yet he nodded. He had crossed too far to retreat now. The figure led him into a chamber where shadows writhed like living things. There were others gathered, faces half concealed, robes blending into darkness. They turned as he entered, their eyes reflecting candlelight like animals watching prey. On a long table stood vessels of wine, plates of fruit, and objects Lorenzo could not immediately name. The air was thick with incense, but beneath it he caught the unmistakable scent of flesh, human, warm, and intimate. The figure placed a hand on his shoulder. What you witness tonight, you must carry in silence, for silence is the only coin accepted here. Speak, and Rome will bury you. Watch, and you will learn what truly binds the church together. Neither scripture nor faith, but desire. The candles flared as if feeding on the very breath of the gathered crowd. Lorenzo felt the ground shift beneath him, as though he had stepped not into a chamber, but into the very heart of Rome's forbidden soul. What awaited him was beyond pilgrimage, beyond faith. It was a secret that had survived centuries, feeding on the night, clothed in power and guarded by silence, and for the first time he understood why the letter had been written not as an invitation, but as a warning. The chamber into which Lorenzo had been drawn was no ordinary gathering place. Its walls, lined with faded frescoes of angels and saints, seemed to mock the living bodies that moved in flickering candlelight. The hooded figure who had brought him here melted into the crowd, leaving him standing alone, heart thundering, as the scent of incense thickened to near suffocation. He did not know whether to step forward or retreat, but when a woman's voice rose in chant, low and melodic, his body leaned instinctively toward the sound. From the shadows emerged a procession of women, their faces veiled, their hands clasped as though in prayer. Their robes were not the black habits of nuns, but white garments cinched with crimson cords, the fabric clinging too closely to suggest purity. They moved in rhythm, circling the chamber like spirits summoned from some older faith than Christianity itself. Their voices entwined, creating a harmony both sacred and unsettling, each note dripping with devotion, yet carrying an undercurrent of something more primal. Lorenzo tried to tell himself he was witnessing an esoteric ritual, some forgotten tradition carried forward by a fringe order of the church. But the longer he watched, the more certain he became that these were no harmless rites of devotion. The women's veils slipped to reveal glimpses of faces, young, beautiful, pale with fervor, and their eyes shone with something unholy. One paused in her steps and fixed her gaze on him, lips parting slightly as though tasting the air around his presence. It was both an invitation and a warning. He dared not move. The hooded figure reappeared at his side and whispered, "These are the brides of silence. They belong to no man, yet they belong to every man who holds power. They wear vows, but their vows are not of chastity. They guard secrets, but their silence is paid in flesh. Tonight you will see what Rome denies, and you will not leave untouched." The procession halted before an altar at the far end of the chamber. Upon it rested a heavy tome, bound in leather cracked with age, its pages marked with ribbons of scarlet and black. A man in Cardinals' robes stepped forward, though his face remained hidden beneath a deep cowl. He placed his hands upon the book, and the room fell into silence. When he spoke, his voice carried authority that chilled Lorenzo to the bone. "This is the covenant of shadows," the cardinal intoned. "In the silence of night, we bind what cannot be confessed. In the hunger of flesh, we pay what cannot be forgiven. The church stands not by faith alone, but by the secrets we bury in her name." At his signal, the women shed their veils, letting them fall to the floor like offerings. Their hair glimmered in candlelight, their eyes burning with feverish devotion. They knelt before the altar, lips moving in whispered prayers that did not resemble any Latin Lorenzo had studied. It was a language older, earthier, more dangerous. The cardinal poured wine into a golden chalice and lifted it high, the crimson liquid trembling like blood under flame. He drank deeply, then passed the cup among the women, each pressing her mouth to the rim in turn. Lorenzo's throat tightened as the hooded figure pushed him gently forward. "Drink," came the whisper, soft but commanding. "To refuse is to mark yourself an outsider. To drink is to be bound." He hesitated, staring at the chalice now held out to him by one of the veiled women. Her eyes bored into him with a hunger that made him shiver. He could walk away, abandon this madness, but he knew he would never be allowed to return to his quiet life unchanged. To turn back was to live with ignorance forever. And so, with trembling hands, he lifted the cup to his lips. The wine was thick, metallic, with a taste that made his stomach twist. It was not merely wine. It carried something more, something that left his tongue numb and his vision sharpening. The chamber's shadows deepened, the candles flickered more brightly, and every breath, every movement, every heartbeat around him seemed amplified. The women's chanting rose again, filling his head with waves of sound that rattled his very bones. One of the women, her robe slipping from her shoulders, leaned close to him. "Now you belong," she whispered, brushing her lips against his ear. He felt her warmth, the press of her hand against his chest, and for a moment he nearly forgot why he had come at all. But then, beyond her, he caught sight of something that froze him. In a corner of the chamber, behind the altar, stood a small iron gate. Through its bars he glimpsed another room, darker than this one, where figures moved with less grace and more violence. Chains clinked. Whispers rose, not in song but in groans of suffering. He blinked, uncertain if the wine had conjured the vision, but the sight lingered. The women's ritual was only the surface of something deeper, crueler. The cardinal closed, the tome with a heavy thud, and the women turned inward, circling Lorenzo now. Their hands reached out, brushing his arms, his face, his hair, their touch both worshipful and consuming. The air grew thick with desire, and yet beneath it ran a current of fear, as though he were not only a participant, but also a sacrifice. The hooded figure leaned close again, voice urgent. "Do not resist. To resist is to die. To obey is to survive long enough to see what lies beyond." And so Lorenzo stood still, his breath ragged, as the brides of silence encircled him, their bodies swaying like a tide he could neither escape nor command. The cardinal raised his hands, and with a voice that shook the chamber's stones, declared, "Tonight, another soul is bound to silence. Another witness is chained to the covenant." The women's chant surged into a frenzy. The candles blazed. Higher, shadows leapt like demons across the frescoed walls, and Lorenzo felt himself drowning in the tide of their hunger. In that moment he understood the terrible truth. He had not stumbled upon a secret gathering. He had been chosen, marked, and drawn into something older and darker than faith, and somewhere beyond the iron gate, in the deeper chambers of the convent, the real secrets of Vatican nights waited for him still. The night after the ritual, Lorenzo did not sleep. Even within the confines of his small room, he could still hear the echo of the women's chanting, feel the press of their hands, taste the metallic sting of the chalice on his tongue. He had walked back through Rome's streets in a daze, every shadow seeming to follow him, every flicker of torchlight carrying the shape of veiled faces. By dawn he sat at the window, staring at St. Peter's dome as if it were watching him, daring him to turn away from the path he had chosen. But turning away no longer felt possible. He had been seen, touched, bound in some way he could not yet define. The memory of that iron gate at the back of the chamber gnawed at him more than the rest. What was hidden there was no ritual for beauty or pleasure. It was something harsher, concealed with chains and silence. And if the letter that summoned him spoke truth, then he had only begun to glimpse the darkness that pulsed beneath Vatican walls. On the third night, the hooded figure came again. No words were exchanged. They were not needed. Lorenzo followed, willingly this time, though his heart thundered as before. They wound through narrow alleys, past sleeping houses and shuttered windows, until they reached another door, not the small one in the colonnade, but a heavy oak portal in the side of a convent, its lintel marked with carved roses. A nun stood guard, her habit immaculate, her face serene, yet her eyes held no softness. Without speaking, she unlocked the door and ushered them inside. The convent's corridors were silent, the air heavy with incense. But as they descended, deeper, the silence shifted, broken now and again by muffled laughter or the faint rustle of silks not belonging to holy women. At last they emerged into a vast hall lit by chandeliers of dripping wax. Here, the grandeur of the Vatican revealed its other face. Marble columns rose to a gilded ceiling, and beneath them stretched long tables overflowing with roasted meats, exotic fruits, goblets of dark wine, and jeweled candlesticks that caught the light like burning stars. Around the tables lounged men of the cloth, cardinals, bishops, abbots, robes loosened, jewels glinting, their faces flushed with indulgence. Between them moved the same women Lorenzo had seen before, now clad in garments more daring still, their laughter mingling with the deep voices of Rome's most powerful men. The atmosphere was not one of prayer, but of excess, a feast worthy of Caesar more than Christ. As Lorenzo stepped into the hall, all eyes seemed to note his presence. Some men raised their cups, others whispered behind their hands. The hooded figure guided him to a seat at the edge of the table, placing a goblet before him filled with thick red wine. He drank cautiously, the taste rich but shadowed with that same metallic tang he had known before. At the head of the table sat the cardinal who had led the ritual. His cowl was lowered now, revealing a face lined with age but fierce with authority. His eyes were sharp as steel, his lips curled in a smile that held no warmth. When he raised his cup, the hall fell silent. "Tonight," the cardinal declared, "we honor the covenant that has kept the church unshaken for centuries. Kingdoms fall, empires crumble, but Rome endures because Rome knows the truth, that power is not in purity, but in possession. We feast, we bind, we silence, and through silence we rule." A murmur of approval spread through the hall. The women leaned closer to their chosen guests, pouring wine, whispering secrets. Lorenzo could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. Here, before him, was no mere scandal of flesh. It was a council of power, masked in ritual, held together by shared hunger and shared silence. The hooded figure bent close to his ear. "Now you see the other half of the covenant. Not just brides of silence, but masters of it. Every man here holds secrets that could unmake nations. They do not pray to God, they pray to silence itself." Lorenzo glanced around, studying faces. He recognized some, men whose names graced the newspapers, princes of the church who preached morality by day. Yet here they were unmasked, their indulgences laid bare. He wondered how many kings, how many queens, how many rulers had bent their knees not to scripture but to this hidden feast. As the meal progressed, the air thickened with revelry. Wine spilled, laughter rose, and the veiled women shed even their last layers of disguise. Some climbed onto tables, dancing between platters of fruit, their bodies illuminated by candlelight. Others whispered into the ears of cardinals, who, in turn, scribbled notes onto scraps of parchment that disappeared into hidden hands. Power was traded here as freely as flesh. Lorenzo's head swam with the intensity of it all. He could not decide whether to recoil or surrender, whether to take notes in his mind as a writer, or to forget it all for the sake of survival. But when his eyes drifted toward the far side of the hall, he saw something that pulled him sharply, back to dread. There was another door, smaller and iron-bound, guarded by two nuns with faces like stone. Men entered there from time to time, always with one of the veiled women on their arm. None returned while the feast continued. From behind that door came muffled cries, sometimes soft, sometimes sharp, but always cut short. The sound barely carried over the music and laughter, but once heard, it could not be unheard. He leaned toward the hooded figure. What lies beyond that door? The figure's eyes, visible now beneath the hood, were dark and unreadable. The place where silence is forged. You are not ready to see it yet. But I saw it before, Lorenzo whispered fiercely. Behind the altar, the iron gate. There are prisoners there. The figure's expression hardened. They are not prisoners. They are offerings, and offerings keep Rome eternal. Before Lorenzo could press further, the cardinal at the head of the table rose again, his voice cutting through the revelry. Enough of feasting. Tonight we renew the vow of silence. Bring forth the chosen. The two stone-faced nuns opened the iron door. A hush fell over the hall as a figure was led out. A young man, thin, his eyes wild with terror. His wrists were bound, his robe torn. He was shoved to the floor before the cardinal, who placed a hand upon his head. This one spoke. The cardinal declared. He broke silence. The hall seethed with disapproval, voices hissing like serpents. The cardinal's hand tightened, and he turned his gaze toward the gathered women. Silence demands sacrifice, and so silence shall be. Fed. The crowd rose as one, chanting words that Lorenzo could not understand. The young man's cries echoed through the vaulted chamber, mingling with the chant until the sound became unbearable. Lorenzo's blood ran cold. He wanted to look away, but his eyes refused. He was watching the cost of secrets, the price of silence. And in that moment, as the feast reached its dreadful climax, Lorenzo knew he was no longer an observer. He was caught within a web from which there was no escape. The cries of the young man lingered in Lorenzo's mind long after the feast had ended. They had carried him out through the iron door again, and when the heavy wood shut behind them, silence fell as though nothing had happened. The cardinals laughed. The women sang. Goblets clinked against plates. And yet Lorenzo felt the weight of a burial stone pressing on his chest. He knew then that the Vatican's greatest secret was not indulgence, nor ritual, nor even desire. It was silence itself. Silence that consumed men whole, leaving no trace of their defiance. The hooded figure appeared at his side once more. "You have seen too much," they whispered. "Tonight decides if you remain among the living, or if silence swallows you as it has swallowed so many others." Lorenzo forced himself to drink from his cup, though the wine tasted bitter as blood. His mind raced. He was a writer, a man who had come seeking truth to put into words, yet here words held no power. Silence was the only currency, and silence was demanded of him. At the feast's end, the guests rose in staggered waves, some leaning on the women for support, others retreating into corridors that spiraled deep into the convent. The hooded figure guided him through a side passage up stone steps until they reached a cloister where the night sky spilled its stars above them. The cool air was a balm after the suffocating incense below. Lorenzo inhaled sharply, desperate for clarity, but even here the silence pressed down. "Why did you bring me?" he demanded, his voice low but firm. "You could have chosen anyone. Why me?" The figure lowered their hood at last. A woman's face, sharp-boned and weary, revealed itself in moonlight. Her eyes were steady, but sorrow pooled deep within them. "Because you are not bound by oaths," she said. "You are not clergy. You are not noble. You are no one. And no one can tell the truth more freely than a man who has nothing to lose." Lorenzo's heart tightened. "Then you expect me to write this, to reveal it?" "No," she said quickly. "You cannot reveal it. If you speak, you will vanish as others have vanished. But you can carry it, you can know it, and in knowing, you will never again mistake the church for what it pretends to be." They walked in silence along the cloister until dawn's first light brushed the horizon. Bells tolled in the distance, summoning monks to morning prayer, their voices rising in hymns that sounded pure and unbroken. To anyone else, it was holy music. To Lorenzo, it was a veil stretched thin across a darkness that could never be sung away. The woman stopped beside a carved stone fountain. "This is where—" "I leave you. You will go back to your inn, you will pack your things, and you will leave Rome. If you stay, silence will claim you. Do you understand?" Lorenzo nodded slowly, though every part of him wanted to argue, to demand more answers. He wanted to see beyond the iron door, to know the fate of the young man, to expose what he had witnessed. But deep down, he knew the woman was right. To stay was to die. When he returned to his room, the city was already waking. Merchants opened their stalls, pilgrims flooded the square, and sunlight gilded the dome of St. Peter's. Life carried on as though nothing had happened. And perhaps for everyone else nothing had. He packed his satchel with trembling hands. The letter that had brought him here lay on the table, its ink faded further, as though eager to dissolve into nothing. He tucked it away, not as proof, but as reminder. Proof would never be possible. Rome had ensured that. At the station, as the train prepared to depart, Lorenzo lingered on the platform. He watched priests hurry past, their robes swaying, their faces serene. He wondered which of them had feasted the night before, which had whispered their vows of silence, which had seen blood spilled in the name of power. None showed the slightest trace of what lay beneath their holy masks. That was Rome's triumph, the perfect illusion. When the train pulled away, he pressed his forehead against the glass, just as he had upon arrival. But this time, the city did not gleam with promise. It loomed, heavy and eternal, a fortress of silence. He thought of the woman, of her sorrowful eyes, of her warning. He thought of the brides of silence, of the Cardinals' words, of the cries that would haunt his nights. He thought of what it meant to live with truth he could never speak. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of Rome rang again, chasing away dawn's shadows. But for Lorenzo, silence was the only sound that remained, and in that silence, the true power of the Vatican endured.